But at the heart of this book is both the political and institutional history of the Immigration Enforcement Agency, the bureaucracy, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the business people, and ordinary citizens that pushed for and profited from deportation, but also the migrants targeted for expulsion, those most affected, and the people that organized and pushed back, all right? Like the individuals you see here in this photograph from the early 1950s, who had recently been deported from South Texas, a Mexican family who was making a 400-mile trek by foot back to San Luis Potosi, their home state. And you may notice, this was an entire family, not just, single male laborers, which is another thing to keep in mind. But the first thing that I'd like to highlight and emphasize for you is that the history of the deportation machine, is bipartisan. And this is not something that emerged during the presidency of Donald Trump, nor Barack Obama or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton for that matter. The story that I trace starts in the 1880s. It covers 140 years, a long bipartisan history in which Democrats and Republicans alike have promoted and implemented punitive policies, right, that have built the deportation machine we now know, and that we saw kind of running on all cylinders during the last 4 years of the previous administration. But not everyone realizes this, right? And the machine has been driven by a number of different factors and interests, right? Bureaucratic, capitalist, and racist imperatives have propelled the machine forward during this time period. And it's led to the growth of state power. It's ensured the United States has long had an exploitable migrant labor supply. And it's also shaped ideas about who belongs and who doesn't, who is an American. It's shaped the contours of xenophobia. And this photograph is from a farm raid in the 1970s. You can see the baskets of picked vegetables and agriculture kind of left there on the side as the immigration vans drive away. So the first thing is the long bipartisan history. The second thing that I'd like you all to focus on is the fact that deportation without due process has long been the American way. This is something that's come up more recently as the Trump administration pushed for expedited removals. But in fact, the vast majority, 85% or more of expulsions during the last century and a half have been through streamlined, expedited, unilateral, mostly administrative processes that have provided migrants with few, if any, legal rights and little chance to fight to stay in the country. Now, before we go further, I need to explain to you a little bit more about the inner workings of the machine, right? The book is called The Deportation Machine. I want to tell you what I mean by that. And the machine, as I came to realize over time, has really three main mechanisms that are constant, right? They kind of ebb and flow. They go up and down in terms of how immigration officials are using them. But the three main mechanisms are formal deportations, voluntary departures, which is a euphemism, and self-deportations. The formal deportations and voluntary departures I'll describe briefly before moving on to the self-deportations. Now, formal deportations are what we've heard about most. They show up in the news, they're reported on. If you followed this topic during the Obama years, there was the talk of the 400,000 people per year being deported. Traditionally, they've been by order of an immigration judge, although that's become less so as deportations have become streamlined in the last decade or two. But traditionally, there was some kind of formal legal process that would happen after someone was apprehended, and they carried with them more severe consequences than the other mechanisms of expulsion. Now, as you see in this graph, formal deportations really pale in comparison to voluntary departures until very recently. Really, it's not until 1996 that we see an uptick. And all of a sudden, by 2011, formal deportations outnumbered voluntary departures. Now, what are voluntary departures? Let me say, first of all, there's nothing voluntary about them, okay? These are deportations that happen through administrative means. They happen after someone has been apprehended, okay? So after an immigration official or agent apprehends someone, they pressure, coerce, trick, even sometimes forge their signature on a form that says, I agree to leave the United States and I will pay my own way, right? This happens after apprehension. Okay, so this is not people picking up and deciding to move back to their country of origin. This happens after apprehension. And the best way I can explain it to make it more concrete, perhaps, because it is, a tricky thing to grasp sometimes, is that voluntary departures play a very similar role in the immigration enforcement system as plea bargains play in the criminal justice system. They are the best of all of the bad options people face after being apprehended or arrested, right? And most cases in the criminal justice system, they never go to trial because the courts, threaten people with multiple decades in prison in order to get them to plead to a lesser, to a lesser deal. They're still punished. That's the important thing to emphasize here. This still represents a punishment, but they leverage, right? They leverage this mechanism to encourage people to accept it, to avoid formal deportation and more serious consequences. Now you can see in this chart that if we don't consider voluntary departure, we're really missing most of the history of deportation up until the last decade or two, right? And these happened through incredibly violent means in many cases, which we'll circle back and discuss in a minute. But that is something to keep in mind and to emphasize, and it's 85%. 48 million of the 57 million deportations since the 1880s have happened by voluntary departure. This is essentially how the machine has run. And it's only been possible because it's been streamlined and limited people's rights. Now, the third mechanism is self-deportation. And here I wanted to turn briefly and just read a short excerpt, one of a few that I'll share with you today. Self-deportation's origins, I trace back really to before the founding of the country, right? And what do I mean by self-deportation? Well, I'll read this short excerpt and then explain a little more. The man you see here, Charles Fayette McGlashan, lived what some might call an exemplary 19th century American life. The sixth child and first son of a French-Canadian schoolteacher mother and Scottish immigrant farmer father who loved music, Charles was born in Black Hawk Country in Wisconsin Territory on April 12, 1847. Less than a year before the area became the 30th state of the Union. He spent part of his infancy in the 581-person town of Plymouth in Rock County. But the family soon loaded themselves and their possessions into an ox wagon and headed west, arriving in California in 1854. The gold rush having passed them by, the McGlashans lived modestly. Charles swept the floors of his Sonoma County school to help pay for his education. In 1872, at age 24, he married and moved to Truckee, a raucous railroad and logging town just north of Lake Tahoe, near the summit of the Sierra Nevada. McGlashan quickly became one of the town's most prominent citizens and remained so for the next 6 decades. When he died in January 1931, residents mourned the passing of the man they considered Truckee's patriarch. And today, he is celebrated as a hero and a Renaissance man. Most remembrances, however, make no mention of the fact that during his lifetime, Charles McGlashan was best known, not just locally, but throughout California, as a leading figure in the anti-Chinese movement, a nativist who pioneered a new method of effecting mass expulsion through self-deportation. So I wanted to share that story. This is what begins the first chapter of the book. This was not a story I knew until I started doing this research. But what Charles McGlashan did, as so many others have since, and some of them, as the story illustrates, were just ordinary citizens. They're ordinary citizens, ordinary people living in the United States. Others were federal officials or local officials. But the idea behind self-deportation is to make people's lives so miserable that they pick up and leave, right? Supposedly on their own. Although, as I really strongly push back against that and show in the book, it's in response to these concerted efforts, to get people to leave. It's a cost-saving measure, perhaps. It's sometimes implemented through violence or the threat of violence. It is sometimes implemented by local, state laws like SB 1070 in Arizona, and others that might encourage people to move elsewhere, either within the United States or even out of the country altogether. And that's what Charles McGlashan and many others like him in the late 19th century tried to do when they attempted to remove the Chinese community, both from their towns and from the country. Now, this leads to some of the early federal immigration legislation. It's not until 1891 that the federal government gets control over immigration. Up until then, states and localities controlled immigration policy. And this is something that we've seen as a constant. And I think if there's anything that changed during the Trump administration, it was really the ramping up of self-deportation efforts to levels we had not seen in quite some time. So these are the mechanisms of the machine, all right? Formal deportations, voluntary departures, self-deportations. The third point I'd like you to keep in mind, which I'd be happy to discuss, and as I mentioned earlier, is that deportation has disproportionately targeted Mexicans throughout US history. Right? Mexicans, as I mentioned, represent about 90% of all deportees. That's disproportionate to their representation of the population, the immigrant population, as well as the undocumented population in the country. And these efforts really pick up in the 19-teens and 1920s. You see here a series of newspaper headlines from La Opinión, Spanish language newspaper based in Los Angeles, of immigration raids and deportations during the Great Depression, right, in which there was a crackdown on the Mexican, and I should mention and emphasize Mexican-American community as well. Any ethnic Mexican was subject to removal potentially. And hundreds of thousands of people were repatriated. Some of them went by force. Some of them were coerced to leave. Some of them went because the Mexican government provided certain incentives. They wanted to go back. But everyone who went back made their decisions in this broader context of anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-Mexican sentiment. If we fast forward a couple of decades, in the 1950s, the infamous Operation Wetback campaign, and I use that word in the historical context. It's a slur to refer to the Mexican migrants who crossed the Rio Grande River and emerged on the other side of the United States, with their clothes wet. But that was the official government language. And I think it's important to note that, and to note how widely it was used in the media and in letters to the editor. And this was something that I think really had consequences in shaping ideas about who belonged and who didn't. In the picture at top here, you see a roundup of Mexican agricultural workers in Texas during that campaign in 1954. And the picture at bottom is actually in Chicago. This deportation drive led to hundreds of thousands of people leaving the country by force and coercion, and some in urban centers far from the border, some very close to the border. But the targeting of Mexicans has been a constant, and I think that's really had a detrimental impact in ways that I like to discuss now. This photograph is so striking to me. It feels like it could be, from today or recently, right? You see the boy in the front there holding a sign saying, "Reagan, no me separes de mis padres," right? Reagan, don't separate me from my parents. And this was a protest that happened in Santa Ana, California in the 1980s after immigration officials apprehended, coerced, or enforced a 14-year-old permanent resident into signing a voluntary departure form and removed him to Mexico. And this was not uncommon. People in the country legally, or US citizens for that matter, who were targeted and racially profiled and removed. And one of the things I found most striking in my research, and I did archival research, extensive archival research in the United States and Mexico, but I also did oral histories and interviews, and I spoke with people who had been deported. I spoke with the family members of people and learned more about how deportation affected entire networks of people, entire communities of people. And some of the things that they told me really resonated with what we've seen in recent years, unfortunately. And people described the presence of immigration officials in the community, carrying out immigration raids on a weekly basis, a regular basis. And this is a period in time in the 1970s that I mark as an important moment of change. This is what I call the dawn of the age of mass expulsion. It's starting in the mid to late 1970s that we see deportation, or the possibility of deportation, become a fact of everyday life for many immigrants living especially in the Southwest and on the West Coast. But this is a period where an average from 1978 to 2008, an average of 900,000 people every year deported. Again, deportation, or the possibility of deportation, becomes a fact of everyday life. And that really, unsurprisingly, had a horrible detrimental impact on the immigrant community and on Latinos more broadly. So some of the people I spoke with, described living in Southern California and stopping, their regular activities. They didn't go to the store anymore. They didn't go to the market. They didn't go to the park because of the possibility of apprehension. When the immigration officials started raiding the church, they stopped going to Sunday Mass. I mean, these are things that, again, really resonate, I think, with what we've seen in recent years. And it's important to recognize not only the moments of change, but the ways in which there's continuity to this story. When we think about broader questions about the United States, the reputation, the United States, the mythical reputation they put forth of this country as a nation that's welcomed immigrants throughout its history. Well, what do we walk away with when we start to consider the fact that close to 1 million people per year for the last 40 years, essentially, had been apprehended and deported? It tells a very different story, perhaps, and forces us to confront some difficult questions. The next thing I would like to share with you is something that came readily apparent. And this was something certainly that we can relate to today when thinking about maybe the private detention industry and the role that private companies play in immigration detention, but the human cost of deportation. And this goes back to my interest in learning more about the experience of those most affected, but really grappling with what the human costs are of US state-sponsored policies, right? The state-sponsored policies that have turned deportation into a lucrative business. Different policies could lead to different ends, but there's a real through line here of policies that I traced really for the last century that have told a much different story. And I wanted to share just a brief example here. In January 1928, I.M. Adler, owner of a steamship and tourist agency in New Haven, Connecticut, wrote a letter to his senator. It occurred to me that the United States government can save itself quite a sum of money and annoyance each year in the matter of deportation of aliens, he wrote. Noting that the government purchased a large number of steamship tickets each year for deportees rejected at Ellis Island and those already in the country whom officials considered to be undesirable, Adler offered his services. He wrote, as the authorized agent for all steamship lines and someone who spoke 7 different languages, he suggested that this was going to be a win-win proposition. The government would save money by outsourcing and centralizing the purchase of deportation fares, and he would benefit from the windfall of new business. Now, in this particular example, the Immigration Service decided to pass on Adler's proposal, but the story is instructive. By the 1920s, deportation had become a business, and there was money to be made. And that remained true in the decades ahead. So you see this photograph here of an airplane owned by Flying Tiger Airlines, which became one of the largest air cargo transport companies in the United States. It was bought out by FedEx in 1988. But it was founded after World War II. And one of the ways they made business was by deporting tens of thousands of Mexicans from the United States into the Mexican interior. The US government contracted them to do so. And some of you may be familiar with the famous Woody Guthrie song, Deportee, Plane Wreck at Los Gatos. If not, I encourage you to look it up after. It's a very moving story, very disturbing story. And if you're interested, you might know already, but Tim Z. Hernandez has written an excellent book on it from University of Arizona Press. And you can learn much more about that history there. But one thing about that story that a lot of people don't know is that that was a privately contracted plane that those individuals, unfortunately, very tragically died on when it crashed. And this through line of the business of deportation is something I trace mostly throughout the middle part of the 20th century, from the 1920s into the 1950s and beyond into the 70s. And one of the ways that I do that and bring that out was this incredible archival discovery I made in looking at a boat trip, essentially, across the Gulf of Mexico that US and Mexican officials collaborated on. They hired, and I should emphasize, they hired private Mexican companies to carry out this operation. And they paid them to deport close to 50,000 Mexican migrants in the middle of the 1950s from Port Isabel, Texas, down to Veracruz. And these boats carried deportees south and then returned to the United States with bananas in those same holds from the Mexican state of Tabasco, which you can see here on the map, up to Alabama. And then on the return trip, they picked up what they considered human cargo, right? That was the way that they saw the human beings they were transporting. And the very fact that they were seeing them, that US and Mexican officials were seeing them, and the language they use to describe migrants is incredibly revealing, incredibly disturbing, but also helps to explain how they could justify such treatment, right? How these state policies, could remain in place for so many decades. So the story that I trace, looks at what these trips look like from the inside of the boats as much as I could. I was trying to better understand what it was like for individuals, caught up in the deportation machine and forced onto these boats. And just a quick side note here. On some of these trips, 100% of the 800 people that some of these cargo vessels carried, 100% were deported via voluntary departure, right? That administrative mechanism, as I noted. But this photo looks down into one of the holds of the boat, the Mercurio. And if you can see on the right-hand side there looks to be a young, perhaps teenage boy kind of staring up at the camera. His gaze, we're looking straight into the lens. This photo kind of haunts me in a way. It's impossible to understand and impossible to comprehend really what these experiences might have been like. And I think it's at the same time really important to grapple with the impact of US policies and Mexican policies as well on the lives of so many millions of people. And that's what I try to get at and try to show in this particular chapter. But what became clear was that punishment and profits, together, that toxic combination, exacted an extraordinary human cost. And some of you may be familiar with, through your work with No More Deaths on the Border, these policies of prevention through deterrence, right? Building up border enforcement in urban areas to make it more difficult to cross, so people cross through more desolate, more dangerous areas. And the US immigration officials believe that that's going to deter people from coming. It doesn't, we know, but it does lead to more deaths. And this was a similar operation. The boat lift was strategically used by officials to discourage people from returning to the United States. The commissioner of immigration at the time was a former general, lieutenant general in the US Army, Joseph Swing. And he testified before Congress, even though the US officials said that we are just returning people closer to their homes, almost as if it was a humanitarian act. Swing testified before Congress and said, and I'm quoting him here, right? He said, "The Mexicans hate the boat lift like the devil hates holy water. It's the most salutary thing that we've hit upon yet," right? It was meant to punish. It was meant to discourage people from coming back. That was built into the policy, all right? I think that's important to highlight. And that brings me to the last point that I'd like to share with you, right? And that is that for as long as the deportation machine has existed, people have been organizing and fighting against it, right? Just like you have been in recent years and since you've gotten involved with No More Deaths and perhaps in other ways as well. And I tell a story in the book of how people identified the vulnerabilities of the machine. I think something that's important to remember, something that I realized as I was doing the research, is that the deportation machine has always been vulnerable. It remains vulnerable today. Where it's vulnerable, the points of vulnerability change. The strategies that are most effective to use against it shift over time. So activists have tried to pinpoint, where those points of weakness are, and then apply as much pressure as possible to them, right? And in the 1970s, the US government's reliance on voluntary departure was such that 98% of people were deported through voluntary departure. And if any proportion of those individuals rejected voluntary departure and said, no, I'm going to fight my case, I'm going to stay here in the United States, the whole machine would have come to a grinding halt. And a group of shoe factory workers, 60 shoe factory workers at a suburban Los Angeles factory, realized this, and they organized, right? They were involved in a union organizing campaign, And they organized against the deportation machine so that when they were apprehended one morning during a raid at 8 o'clock in the morning, when 40 immigration officers sealed off all the exits to the factory they worked in, went through indiscriminately questioning everyone, returned to downtown Los Angeles that same morning with 119 people in custody. 8 hours later, that same day in the afternoon, half of those individuals were on their way to the Mexican border to be deported via voluntary departure. But the buses never made it to the border that day, because what was happening in the background was that the union organizers, the lawyers that were involved, and the migrants themselves had mobilized a network, a rapid response network, essentially, that filed an injunction with a federal judge and stopped their deportation. Many of those individuals ended up having their deportations thrown out, were able to stay in the United States because the federal government couldn't establish their place of birth and their citizenship. And also they filed a class action lawsuit, which led to an increased rights for more than 1 million people that were currently in the country at that time without documents, right? So that's just one example. And I traced the story of that organizing campaign in great detail. But it's really important, I think, to remember that solidarity matters so much. And in more recent years, as this picture shows, people continue to take to the streets. These are actually students, mostly students from UIC, right, where I teach. And this is a photograph of a march about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when some of the early organizing campaigns and coming out of the shadows campaigns really spread across the country, and people took to the streets as undocumented and unafraid. And now I think we're starting to see the payoff. I think 15 plus years of sustained organizing and solidarity and activism, I think you can see the fingerprints of it all over Biden's immigration bill that was proposed today in the House and the Senate. Right? It has the fingerprints of activists and organizers. And it's not on the table because politicians all of a sudden felt generous or directly in response to the previous administration. It's on the table because immigrants, advocates, organizers, and activists changed the conversation. They kept the pressure up. And now there's a real possibility for change. I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'd be happy to talk about kind of immigration policy today and moving forward. There's still a long way to go. And I think because of the long bipartisan history, people really want to see Biden act. They don't want to see him talk so much, but they really want to see him act. And I'd be curious to hear what you all have to say about this as well. So I will leave it at that. And I'm really looking forward to the question and answer and conversation we have. I just wanted to put up my contact information in case you have follow-up questions we don't get to today. And if you are interested in the book, the press, Princeton University Press, is offering a discount using the code there at the bottom of the screen. So thank you all so much. And really anything that you'd like to discuss, I am game.
Thank you, Adam. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm sure a lot of folks learned quite a bit from that, and I'm certain that there must be questions and comments. So we can just go ahead and open it up for questions.
Yeah, I will do my best to field questions, and feel free to raise your hand if that's easiest, or to mention in the chat. But I saw a hand, I think, Alexander.
Hi, first I want to thank you. That was very informative.
You're welcome.
What goes into writing something so heavily researched while at the same time meant for a very broad audience? Can you talk about the difficulties there?
Oh, how much time do we have? Man, that is a great question. It is something I've thought a lot about. It's something that easier said than done. I would say that, in a way, I think that my book can be read on a few different levels, right? And my direct response to your question would be that I edited and revised and revised and revised, and I just kept revising. And what I think I ended up with, what I aimed for at least, is that you can read the main text of my book and get the essential story, right? And general readers and many students, I think, will be more interested in that. But if you're interested in going deeper, I have 90 pages of discursive notes at the end. They're not kind of one-line footnotes just citing the source, but there's actually an engaged discussion and a whole other discussion happening in the notes that are at the end of the book. So I think when I was going through, I needed to decide for myself, is this an essential piece of information, or is this something that I can discuss in the footnotes? Should this be one sentence or one paragraph, a page or two, a section, or maybe, you know what, as interesting and cool as this is, it just doesn't fit in the narrative that I'm telling. So I was asking myself those types of questions until I got it down to, I think, a readable, streamlined narrative, essentially, that could operate on different levels for different people.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, Catherine, Sophia, I saw, and others should feel free to jump in as well.
Okay, yeah, I just have a quick question. So my dad is from England, and he was here on a green card for a really long time, and then he became a citizen when I was 12 years old of the US. And I remember him studying, like, to take the tests and doing all this work, and it was like so hard for him to do that. And I know I've heard like people say it's almost impossible to pass that. It's super hard, and you really have to put in a lot of work. Is that done on purpose to prevent people from trying to become a citizen, or do you know why like that's so extensive, like work to like become a US citizen?
Yeah, that's a good question, and this is one of the things that's up in the air now as well. The test is, somewhat rigorous. I think that many people who prepare and study for it end up passing. The Trump administration had proposed to overhaul this test and invested resources to propose an entirely new test. The Biden administration, since taking office, has rolled that back, and they're not going to go with the new version, which is going to be longer, more complicated. And something you didn't mention, but oftentimes plays a big role, is that they've increased the price of citizenship, right? How much you have to pay to become a permanent resident, how much you have to pay to become a citizen has gone up. And the Trump administration had proposed raising it by 80%. Right? We're not talking about a small bump here. And that oftentimes can be really limiting. Combined with the fact that while they were doing that, they were cutting back the staffing and cutting back the budget for US citizenship immigration services. So it would take longer for government officials in the bureaucracy to process these applications, right? And we could intuit perhaps any number of motives behind that, perhaps related to reducing the number of possible voters that would vote against the Republican Party. Although oftentimes immigration doesn't break down on a strictly party line basis. But I think it's an important question to realize what it means to be a citizen in terms of what you have to do, the hoops you have to jump through has changed over time. It's in flux as well, and that's important to recognize. I appreciate the question.
Thank you
Sophia,
so much.
of course.
Hi, I was wondering, does colorism play a role at all in who gets deported?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it speaks to this fact, I think, that I mentioned earlier, that Mexicans have been so disproportionately targeted, and sometimes that's been racially motivated. But what I show in the book is that also the disproportionate targeting of Mexicans has also racialized Latinos, right? The process of enforcing immigration law and disproportionately targeting a particular group has led to the false kind of stereotype of ethnic Mexicans as prototypical illegal aliens, right? In the words of the law, although that's on the table to be changed as well. And, I think it's really astounding in a way. Most people don't realize this, but in more recent years, Central Americans have been increasing the focus of immigration enforcement efforts. But if you add up the number of people apprehended from Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, those four countries make up, I think, 96 or 97% of all apprehensions. I mean, which is just really astounding and disturbing. But that disproportionate focus on Latinos has, I think, been extraordinarily harmful on an individual basis, but also, on a larger basis, a group basis, and equating kind of race and ethnicity with illegality, has had, extraordinarily negative consequences. Catherine, and I also see in the chat here, I'll try to get to these questions as well. Catherine.
I'm sorry, I just forgot to lower my hand from earlier.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
So I see a question here in the chat from Susan Deeds. Hello, Susan. Nice to see you. I think we last saw each other in Mexico City, probably. And the question is, how do you really see what Biden is proposing? Has he, backed down on other issues? What can he do? And this is really the million-dollar question, right? I mean, the proposals coming out of the Biden administration, I've actually been pleasantly surprised. I think that it is important to recognize that the fact that they put on the table today a proposal that would lead to regularization of status and citizenship within 8 years, that is a break from the past, right? The old model of comprehensive immigration reform will trade some kind of regularization for enhanced enforcement. They're not putting that forward in the same way that Democratic administrations have in the past. Now, what makes it through, the congressional debates is a whole other question. But I do think that that is really encouraging in a way. And I do think that's only in response, as I mentioned, to activists and organizers. But the follow through here is going to be the big question, right? Will they maintain the same type of energy to push for progressive change on immigration as the previous administration did to restrict immigration? I think that's an open end, and at this point, an open question that we don't know the answer to. But I would say, and cautiously optimistic is how I'm thinking about it at the moment. And the executive orders, were also really important because with immigration, there's kind of two things happening at once. And you all know this better than I probably from the work you're doing, right? I mean, on the one hand, we need to entirely dismantle the deportation machine and transform our immigration system to focus more on service and less on enforcement, to kind of redo the whole model. And that's an enormous project that would, take a miracle perhaps to get through Congress to thread that needle. But at the same time as we need this broad, radical transformation of the system, people every single day right now need aid, assistance, and attention, right? From facing deportation, facing detention. Those are two things that are simultaneously on the table and need to, I think, be kept in mind. It's not just kind of holding out for the most radical transformation possible. It's providing for the people that need the help here and now, while also pushing for these broader changes. And I would just say one last thing on that is that, the best way to shift the focus from enforcement to service, or the best way, as activists have put it, to abolish ICE, right? The best way to do that would be a widespread legalization. So if this administration could somehow push that through Congress, that legalizes the people currently in the country without status and also provides some additional ways for people to come to the United States with authorization. In other words, so we're not in the same place 10, 20, 30 years from now. Because if the deportation machine has no one to target, right? If no one's here without status, right? It's a lot easier to wind down some of the enforcement services and attention and budget. But these are big open questions at this point. I appreciate it. Thank you. Let's see. Elizabeth, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. First of all, this is excellent, and I really look forward to reading your book. And I just wondered how you had that very powerful image of the protest and the children saying, "Please don't separate me from my father." And I wonder how intentionally, in terms of policymakers, people who are pushing the deportation machine, as you put it, how much are they thinking about children explicitly? And the historic examples I'm most familiar with are Pedro Pan, the children in the 1960s, but I'm also thinking about more recent streams, 2014, and then onwards. So just if you could talk about children in this deportation machine.
Thank you so much for that question. And this is something that a great example actually of, I found some incredible archival sources on this. I wasn't able to include everything that I had, but actually in the Mexican National Migration Institute archives, there's all these files of unaccompanied minors, is the terminology we'd use today, or mothers with young children in the United States, and they're apprehended and deported. And in some cases, federal officials made accommodations, what they saw as humanitarian accommodations, and they would, in a weird way, they would separate families as a humanitarian measure, because they didn't want to deport the women and children deep into Mexico on train trips. They just put them back across the border by foot, but they would deport the men, husbands, fathers, deeper into Mexico. So you saw things like that come up sometimes, but most of the research that I did didn't get too detailed into specific policies immigration officials had for children. There's some wonderful work being done right now by a young woman who is finishing up her PhD at Columbia, Yvonne Padilla Rodriguez, who is writing about child migrants, agricultural workers who are targeted by deportation in the school to deportation pipeline. So I think her work's going to be really groundbreaking in this area, and I'm really looking forward to that. But it is an important thing to acknowledge that immigration officials sometimes treated men, women, and children differently, and not just based on their sex or their age, but they would also make normative judgments, right? Is this woman an honorable woman? Is she a mother and a wife, or is she perhaps involved in illicit activity like prostitution, right? And they would treat people differently depending on the values that they projected onto them. So I appreciate the question. I wish I had more information in response to it. But I think it is something that we see this through line today. Obviously, so many of us have been just horrified by the news and really wondering more about the history. I think it'll be important to keep in mind moving forward. So thank you for bringing that up. Other questions, thoughts, reflections? I'd love to hear from you all as well about the work that you're doing locally and through No More Deaths, if any of these themes or topics resonated and some of the things that you're seeing through your activism.
There's another question in the chat. Alexander Farash has asked how you think the increased militarization of the border affects what we can do as activists.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, that's a good one. I think it's made it challenging, to be honest. In some ways, as I mentioned, the story I tell is one of continuity, right? The mechanisms remain the same. Who officials have targeted has changed over time, but immigrants have been conveniently and consistently used as scapegoats for other problems and as perceived threats, different moments in time. But one thing we have seen is that deportation, what it means to be deported, kind of the consequences of being deported, that's changed over time. And really, during the last 20 years or 25 years, from the mid-1990s to the present, it's become extraordinarily punitive, in part because of what you bring up, Alexander, the militarization of the border, right? Because before, people could more easily cross the border again to reunite with their families, right? They were deported via voluntary departure, as I mentioned, and that carried with it lesser consequences. It was still punitive, but it carried with it lesser consequences. Now, more people are deported via formal deportation, right? Which can include multi-year, even lifetime bans on re-entering the country. And even if someone wanted to re-enter the country, it would be much more difficult to do so because there's more than 700 miles of barriers and walls dividing the two countries. And there's 20,000 Border Patrol agents, which has gone up, I don't know, by a factor of 5 or 6 since the 1990s. So it does make, I think, the situation more urgent than ever. And the work you're doing is incredibly important. And I think actually much more important because of how difficult the reality is for so many people that are interested in these humanitarian questions related to migration. So I think it makes it more urgent. It makes it more urgent. And more groups like No More Deaths are needed. If anything, we need more people working on all fronts in all ways possible on this issue. And if there's a silver lining to the abhorrent policies of the previous administration, it's that more people know about immigration issues and care about immigration issues now than any other time during my lifetime, I think. And that creates certain possibilities and opportunities for organizers and activists. Kyla.
As you've been discussing kind of the previous administration, I've seen there's also just been more common narrative of criminal kind of element as well, and I was just wondering if you encountered any of that in your research, like evidence for that, or to refute it as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really important point about the way that we talk about migrants, the way that we talk about people in the country without authorization. And legally, the legal code has long referred to people without authorization as illegal aliens. Right? That is the legalese, the terminology written kind of on the books. And the Biden administration has actually proposed to change that. A welcome proposal. It's not the first time, actually. In my research, I discovered kind of a similar instance, a parallel example in the 1970s during the Jimmy Carter presidency. And in 1977, Jimmy Carter appointed Leonel Castillo, Mexican-American, Houston comptroller, right? Former high school football star, Peace Corps volunteer, appointed him at 37 years of age to be the new commissioner of the Immigration Naturalization Service. Now, Castillo, a Mexican-American who came from Texas and was involved in activism growing up, he tried to reform the agency from within. And he ran into a lot of challenges, a lot of problems, a lot of roadblocks, right? He faced people from within the agency, kind of the rank and file agents who push back, sometimes in overt racist ways, other times by slow walking their work and not really doing their job as they're supposed to. And sometimes they just showed their cards, laid the blatant racism on the table. And some of the conversations I had with lawyers that were around the INS at that time, interviews I did, were really disturbing, where there would be a photograph of Castillo with a bullseye put on it in the INS office in Washington, D.C., and other kind of disparaging remarks and racist images that Border Patrol agents commonly used. And despite the fact that Castillo and Carter tried to change the language and terminology from illegal alien to undocumented worker in the late 1970s, that didn't stick. And some of the broader changes they put forth actually never happened, because Carter and Castillo, perhaps like Biden and Alejandro Mayorkas, the new Department of Homeland Security Secretary, right, who himself is an immigrant, a Cuban refugee family, they're also law and order liberals. And, the law is the law. And if they're in these positions, chances are they're going to be enforcing the law and carrying out deportations. So activists, as well as people from within the immigration service, ended up really disliking Castillo. He ended up leaving in 1979 with few allies and a lot of enemies. And I don't know what'll happen now with Joe Biden and the reforms that he's trying to push through. But I do think it is really important, the language and the way we think about other human beings, the false binary between us and them, that needs to go. It does not hold up to scrutiny for so many people. And it reinforces the idea of some people as outsiders and others, as Americans. And, that really needs to change. And that could start with the language.
I can add a sort of an almost funny story that's relevant to that. A number of years ago in 2012, I co-produced a CD as a fundraiser for No More Deaths called Border Songs. It was spoken word and music about the border and immigration. And all the profits went to No More Deaths. We raised almost $100,000. And we sold a lot of them to academic libraries all over the country. And I looked at one of the library catalog entries one day, and I realized that the Library of Congress had the book, had the CD cataloged as a subject of illegal aliens. And apparently there was no way to change that. I don't know if it has changed yet, but at that time, that was an official subject of the Library of Congress. And even this object that was made to completely try to oppose that language was being cataloged with that language in every single academic and non-academic public library in the country.
No, that's a really revealing story, Bob. I'm glad you brought it up. It also reminds me of a similar thing, just very quickly, so I see there's a couple other questions. About a decade ago, I wrote an article for Salon.com, which at that time actually had more readers than it does today. But it was on the undocumented, unafraid movement, about young people, college students, in Philadelphia, who engaged in acts of civil disobedience, and got arrested, kind of putting their status in the country on the line for this cause. And I reported this article, I wrote it up, sent it to the editor. The editor really liked it. And then he sent me back one last revision. And the last revision was, he changed every instance where I said undocumented immigrant to illegal immigrant. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, this is the movement that they started, which this piece is about, is called Undocumented and Unafraid. Like, I'm not gonna run this piece. So I was at the point I was gonna pull it and not publish it at all. But I pushed back really hard, probably harder than I've ever pushed back at anything. And he eventually kind of, gave in and let me run with undocumented immigrant as the people themselves identified. But to your point, one of the reasons why he argued it should be different was because at that time, and this is no longer the case, this is a positive development in this area. At that time, the Associated Press, the style book for the Associated Press said illegal immigrant. That is no longer the case, right? Activism and pressure has forced them, as well as the New York Times and other outlets, to change. And I think that has a really big impact, and you can see that up and down. I see that there was a question here in the chat, and then Sydney, I also see your hand, but just very quickly, Michelle in the chat asks about what are some other activist groups similar to No More Deaths outside of NAU? And other people here on the call might actually have some ideas here, but I can give you a few ideas. One is the National Day Labor Organizing Network, NDLON, NDLON, which does incredible work on behalf of the immigrant community. And then I would say that there's so many groups working locally, almost anywhere in the country, even, urban areas and non-urban areas, suburban, rural areas. There are people working on behalf of immigrants and immigrants' rights. So I would encourage you to look locally, wherever that might be. Here in Chicago, there's organizations like Organized Communities Against Deportation, which is doing really important work. Alianza Americas, which Dean Boyer knows better than I do. But there's so many people working on these questions in all different ways, kind of on the ground, first responder type work, high level policy work. And I encourage you to kind of poke around and see what's already there. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, but as I said earlier, we need more hands on deck. So that's really important. And I see that some others in the chat may have other ideas as well. That's really wonderful. Sydney, thanks for waiting.
Yeah, of course. So I guess this is like kind of a question and just a little bit of commentary based on like experiences I've had. What are like the potential consequences that you see with Biden's proposal? I mean, he also put out like another plan a few weeks ago that's like a 4-step plan, I believe. I guess just like in reference to like today, I saw that he wants to direct $4 billion towards border security, which like as someone who's working in like immigrant rights areas seems pretty violent and scary, because like like militarization of the border, it doesn't really need any more funding going to it, obviously, which I'm sure we agree on. But and then also like in the plan that he put out a few weeks ago, I think like personally, and I'd like to know like your perspective on this too, I think that some of the phraseology is super dangerous, because he talks about finding the root causes in Central America as like one of the main points, which like historically and in like present imperialism of the United States, we can kind of see like the existence of death squads and like American intervention and creation of genocide. So yeah, I just want to know like your thoughts on those parts of it, because although like some of the measures might seem super performative, I'm kind of scared for undocumented people and just like people in the global South in general.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and as always, the devil's in the details, right? And we don't know yet. I haven't read the 350 pages of the proposals in Congress yet. And there's also a short memo put out about ICE enforcement priorities today, which is also really important and perhaps hard to enforce because there's incredible, as I mentioned, incredible discretionary power in the hands of low-level agents of the state, agents and officers on the line and in our communities. And that creates real challenges, kind of regardless of what the policy is on top. How do you ensure that that policy, if it is progressive or more liberal, how do you ensure that that passes down to the streets and to the border itself? And I think, I don't have any answers at this point, since I'm still waiting to see. I do share a lot of the same concerns that you have. And what I mentioned earlier is that this bill does look different. There is the kind of amorphous language or unclear language about kind of the smart border type stuff, which is I think most of what the enforcement funds would be dedicated to. And maybe you know more than I at this point on that. But it seemed to be less so indifferent than past proposals. Of course, what that means and what that looks like is really important to know more and to understand better in much more detail. The question about the support to Central America is also a good one. And as you expressed, there should be concern with good reason, and what types of funds and who they're going to and what they're meant to do, all crucial questions. And I don't have the answers or any insider information or knowledge on that. We can imagine a scenario perhaps where the funds actually are going to sustaining communities and helping people there stay if they want to stay. I mean, that's been a big push actually within Mexico and Central America, giving people the right to stay, right, to not migrate. History shows that we have good reason to be skeptical, as I know you are, about that, and I do share a lot of those concerns. But I think we need to see a little more detailed information about them, and it's unclear to me at this point. I think it's too early to say. I am more optimistic because of the polarization. The political polarization on this issue has created opportunities. I don't think that the proposals are perfect. I think they're better than in the past, and we'll kind of have to see how this plays out. But the questions and concerns you bring up are really important. So thank you for sharing them with everyone on the call. Sophia?
When I was in high school, I had a Spanish teacher who used to work for ICE. And he told us one day that he had to leave because of some of their practices. And this was even like before Donald Trump was president. So it was like, to me, it just resonated that there have been issues with ICE for a long time, and that it sort of traumatizes the people who work for ICE because they have to do what they're told, and like that's not fair to them either.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point, right? That some people may be in a position where they're uncomfortable doing the work that they're tasked with, right? And they also have the option, like your Spanish teacher, I guess, to leave, right? To quit their job and to find other line of work. And it sounds like they did. And I think other people do that as well. But, historically, like so many other government jobs, right, immigration enforcement positions have provided working class and increasingly working class Latino communities with a steady income, with a middle class living, and you all may know this already, but something I always share with my students, I ask, what percentage of Border Patrol agents do you think are Latino or Latinx? Anyone have any ideas? What percentage of Border Patrol agents are Latinx today? Any guesses in the chat, or unmute yourself, feel free. Somewhat of a leading question. Sorry, was that?
50%.
Yeah, it's a little over 50%, right? About 52% last time I saw. Right? 52% of immigration enforcement officials working for Customs Border Patrol identify as Latino or Latinx. Right? And that in itself is something that's important to understand. There's a political scientist working on this question now at Notre Dame. I'm forgetting his name, but if you look up the department, if you're interested in this question, he's writing articles and is working on a book project about this topic. So yeah, it is challenging. Some people believe kind of, in law and order and, the policies, even if they disagree with them, they'll carry them out. And I think that's a pretty common sentiment. If you talk with people that work for Border Patrol or ICE, I've heard that many times. Just as police officers may disagree with the policies or the laws, but they're tasked with enforcing them. And some decide that they don't want to do that anymore.
There's an incredible book written by a former Border Patrol agent named Francisco Cantu called Where the Line Becomes a River, about his experiences working for Border Patrol and what it did to him. He sort of traces the psychological changes and disturbing traumatic issues that started to even manifest themselves physically in him as he carried out his job until he finally left and became, it seems, a bit of an immigrant rights activist by the end.
Other questions, comments? Madison.
Yeah, so I know you're coming at this from more of like an academic research base, and that kind of leads to like quantifying like people's stories or personal experiences, and like you yourself not having like that, you know, like primary experience of what these people go through. Like, where do you kind of see like your relationship in this issue not being one of those people that is affected? And like, what do you feel is your duty to uplift those stories, but still while honoring them, and kind of dealing, I don't know, like if with existing turmoil or just what your place is in this, and how you feel that has impacted the way that you write off of it?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's an important one, something I've thought about a lot throughout the last decade and working on this project. You know, I think that, you know, from the beginning, I was interested in better understanding the social history, you know, of migrants and people targeted, you know, by these punitive policies, right? I didn't want to just tell kind of a top-down story of U.S. officials carrying out policies and not understanding it from, you know, the perspective of, you know, those most directly affected. And that might include people targeted for apprehension and removal, but also the family members in Mexico. So the time that I lived in Mexico, I lived there for a little over 3 years when I was working on my dissertation and have been back and forth since. And that was really instrumental in seeing, you know, the questions of migration and migration policy, you know, from the other side of the border, spending time in some of the small traditional sending towns, migrant sending towns in states like Jalisco, was really important, I think, in understanding how migration affected those places and those peoples, and also just listening. You know, I went in with all kinds of questions and I tried to ask questions, but I also just tried to listen and learn from people, you know, to not assume that I knew more than anyone. And in many cases, they knew much more than I did, of course, right? So understanding my role and my place there, you know, being humble, I think, is really essential in engaging in any kind of work and research. Certainly historical research projects where archival sources, written records might prioritize the stories of some over others. I tried to cast as wide of a net as possible, and searching out sources. So immigrant rights organizations and lawyers, they provided incredible resources, as well as court records. And then there are the government records, right, which sometimes gave me insights into the lives of migrants, but oftentimes were told, you know, or narrated through the immigration officials themselves, which have to be read with a grain of salt. But the interviews I did, you know, were really crucial in helping to understand, I think, the experience and lives of people, and also ensuring that people were comfortable sharing the stories with me. And if they didn't want to, they didn't have to, of course. Never pushing anyone too hard on that, and also giving the people opportunity to remain anonymous. You know, in most of the examples, I oftentimes use pseudonyms, which people preferred. And, you know, that was something I had very open, frank conversations about. And, you know, that's something that I think I went in with, but I also learned as I went. You know, like any kind of project you're working on, I think you have ideas and assumptions, and then you keep learning things along the way, and you kind of adjust. But, you know, I saw this as an opportunity to explore a really important issue that I don't think we entirely understood. And also, this was something that came not only from my academic intellectual interest, but also kind of personal commitments in life, as well as political commitments. And I think that's partly what sustained me during the many years that I was working on it. And if I didn't care about this topic, and if it wasn't kind of operating on those different levels, I don't know if I would have stuck with it for so long.
Well, clearly you've done a tremendous service, and I want to thank you again for sharing your time with us. I mean, you already inverted 10 years in writing the book, and now it's really illuminating to hear you talk about it, and to inspire us to both educate ourselves further and to do something, to act. There's another question in the chat. I think we could take that one and maybe one more question if there is one. Then I'd like to let you go. You've been going since 6 o'clock. It's almost an hour and a half here.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for being here and for all the wonderful questions and feedback and conversation. These are other opportunities for me to learn and being in discussion with people that are working on these issues and care about these issues. So thank you all for taking time out of your schedules. So I'm seeing the question in the chat. How often were Mexican Americans brought to Mexico, even though they were born in the US, due to being racially profiled and removed? I don't have comprehensive statistics on this. I can't share kind of definitive information, but the numbers are very high. The numbers are very high. And this would oftentimes happen if a parent is removed and then children who are US citizens, or in a mixed status family, if one family member is removed and then others return to Mexico in order to keep the family together, that would oftentimes lead to people with US citizenship or permanent resident status, returning to Mexico. But we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, I can give just one number. I think it was during the early years of the Obama administration, researchers found that it was, I think, close to 500,000 US citizens, mostly young people, were living in Mexico, right? It's kind of an astounding, really upsetting statistic. And there's obviously many more during the campaigns in the 1930s and 1950s that I mentioned. So it's an extraordinarily large number. And that's something that I think is important to keep in mind, that it's not just non-citizens who are affected by these policies and by the deportation machine. Citizens, permanent residents, people in mixed status families. This is something that affects everyone in the United States. Everyone should care about it, right? And I think that's something that's important for everyone to keep in mind.
Last year they were actually invalidating birth certificates for people who had been born in Texas near the border, and saying that they were fraudulent birth certificates and deporting people that were citizens. And here in Arizona, there have been cases of Tohono O'odham Native people who have been mistakenly deported or removed when their people have lived in this area for thousands of years. So yeah, it's definitely a persistent problem. It's not just historical. Any other questions? We could take one more question, or
see in the chat, there's a question about what's next. I'm trying to catch my breath and get some sleep. No, I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to be working on next, but I may return to some interests I had before about questions of U.S. empire and Central American, refugee and asylum seekers in the 1980s. And that was actually a project that I thought I might work on, as this first book. And I shifted directions, and I may return to that. As we all know, it's remained relevant, these broader questions, but I'm just trying to catch my breath at this point. I appreciate the interest.
You deserve some time.
Professor Schwal has recently arrived to NAU and is already thinking about second projects.
That's great. I think at one point I was interviewed for a job, and sometimes it's very common. People will ask you, well, what are you working on? What is your project? And they'll ask you, what is your second project? And someone that I was having an interview with asked me, well, what is your third project? I said, I don't know. I'm just trying to put one foot in front of the other. Get to the end of this process.
Well,
So,
I congratulate you on this one. This is a great work. So I'd like to thank you again and thank everybody for coming. I will share one more time the poster of our upcoming event, because if you were interested in today's event, you'll probably be interested in this one as well, on Thursday, March the 4th at 6 p.m. Actually, the history department has an event on March the 2nd. Elizabeth, can you tell folks the time? I don't have that on the tip of my tongue.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, Dr. Carlos Dimas from the University of New Mexico, Las Vegas, will be speaking about cholera in Argentina. So very timely, and he's going to be connecting his work on 19th century Argentina epidemics with the COVID-19 pandemic. So please come and everyone's welcome. And I believe, Bob, that you sent out the flyer, so you could check that, or you could be in touch with me. I could put my email in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much. Stay healthy, everybody, and look forward to seeing you around. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Take care.